The years between World War I and World War II were full of turmoil. The economy crashed in the Western world, and many democracies struggled to keep the people happy. In Spain, Italy, and Germany, a new form of government was formed called fascism. In Russia, Stalin moved the state into totalitarian-style government. These aggressive and militaristic governments would lead to World War II. Today, we'll look at the interwar years in Western civilization. Immediately after World War I, there was uneasy peace. In Eastern Europe, there was a lot of different ethnic groups living together. There was tension between the Germans and Poland in particular. There was tension in the new formed states of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. They weren't completely ethnically homogeneous states, and these various groups fought each other. In the British Empire, there was a lot of unrest. In India, the native individuals were petitioning for an independent state. In Ireland, there was clamoring for home rule. And so the British Empire started to crumble and fall. There was a lot of tension in Western Europe between the two adversaries, where a lot of death and destruction was fought between them, Germany and France, for control of the border. And the one institution that was supposed to keep the world safe, the League of Nations, was pretty weak. There was a lot of internal problems in Germany. There was a socialist revolution, similar to Lenin and what happened with the Bolsheviks in Russia, though this socialist revolution, Spartacus revolt, was crushed by the German population, but yet it shows the unrest. The Weimar Republic, which was controlling Germany at this time, had a lot of economic problems. In order to deal with the debt, they started printing a lot of money, and there ended up being hyperinflation. There was about 4 marks would buy $1 in 1914. By 1924, it would take 4.2 trillion marks to buy $1. Money was pretty worthless. In addition to the socialist unrest, those on the right, under Hitler, the nationalist fascists, launched a putsch or coup attempt to take over the government with military means in November 1923. It was put down, but again it shows how there was a lot of internal problem. Now, the late 20s, things had kind of sorted out. The economy had taken a turn for the better, and particularly there was a lot more economic prosperity. Japan's economy was growing at a very fast rate. The U.S. economy was doing well. Even those countries that were struggling, like Germany and Britain, things were a little bit better than immediately after the war. There was also a push for better diplomacy. There was arms limitation talk, so they tried to get together and say that they should put a limit on the number of boats, or another limit on the number of the size of the army. There was better relations between France and the Weimar Republic. Things looked a little bit better. Perhaps the most idealistic thing was the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, which over 63 countries signed outlawing war. Of course, it's a pretty weak document, because if somebody breaks it, how are you going to stop it? Well, the only thing you can do to stop it is fight a war. The Roaring Twenties are a symbol of this kind of late prosperity. There was a lot of push for newness. People had discarded traditional values in the wake of World War II, and they looked to modern or postmodern ideals. There's a new style of music thrown out, the classical, the romantic style, jazz music, band music, new style of dancing, a new style of women liberated after their experiences in World War One. The flappers kind of made an appearance, particularly in the United States. There was new forms of mass media. The radio was coming online in the 1920s, and so people were exposed to music more. Not just locally and live, but they could, have celebrities, famous band leaders that would be known throughout the country. Movies started to make their appearance as well, a little bit before World War One, but definitely took off after World War One with the rise of Hollywood in the 1920s. There were silent movies, but they were extremely popular, and there was a proliferation of going to the movies and a Friday, Saturday night, and being exposed to this new mass media. So things started to pick up a little bit. There was a new culture, a very modern culture in the 20s, but all of this started coming crashing down 1929 when the stock market crashed. So there was over speculation. People were buying stocks in the hope that it would rise, and as you can see from 1927 to 1929, stocks almost tripled, and more and more people were pumping money into the stock market. But it was a bubble, and it came crashing down 1929. A lot of people lost their savings, banks failed, and trade basically came to a screeching halt. So it started in the United States, but it spread through all the industrialized world. Like I mentioned, trade went into a tailspin. Therefore, even pretty stable economies were drawn into it because they had no other countries to buy their products. So this impacted the industrial world very much, but there was nobody that was really spared from this kind of economic disaster. The Depression unleashed a lot of hardship among individuals. There was unemployment that we would think is probably astronomical by today's standards. Britain had 25% unemployment. The United States was similar, 25% employment, and this was lasting for almost a decade. Germany was at 40% unemployment. Productivity was The drop in productivity was astonishing. Our gross national product dropped about 50% in the United States, 40% in Germany. This economic disaster leads to homelessness, to poverty, to hunger, to political a lack of stability, and therefore the government tries to step in and help things and make things a little bit better. At first, the economic liberalists, particularly the Republican Party under Hoover, thought that the government shouldn't get too involved, that the economy will kind of straighten itself out. But that was unpopular, and you see a shift to the left and the rise of socialism, and even within the democracies. So in Britain, you had the rise of the Labour Party and Keynesian economics, the belief that you should start spending money even if you don't have it just to get you out of the depression. So the government becomes much larger and starts spending money it doesn't have, deficit spending, in order to kind of boost or stimulate the economy out of this depression. You see something similar with FDR and the Democrats in the United States with the New Deal. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, Civil Works Administration, Works Progress Administration, National Recovery Administration, Social Security, all of these things, safety nets to get people money for those that are disadvantaged, or to get young men in particular working and pay them something, even if it wasn't necessary, something to alleviate the situation. So the government became much bigger, and you see the development of a true welfare state as a response to the Great Depression. Unfortunately, the economic turmoil had an even nastier um, turn, not just living in poor conditions, but the rise of really extreme governments. So you have the near collapse of democracies by the 30s and definitely by the 40s with World War II, where democracy was just holding on by a fringe. Um, and um, in replacing the democracies, you see the rise of totalitarian governments. These are governments that try to control all aspects of life, whether it's education, media, politics, the economy. They try to monitor and control the population in every single facet. So the first form of totalitarian governments that we're going to look at is fascism. Some of the qualities of fascism: it has a charismatic leader like Hitler or Mussolini or Franco in Spain. And these individuals have complete control of the state. They're very popular figures. They're great in terms of public speaking, and there's a whole kind of veneration of them, almost as a deity. They're extremely nationalistic. They have a lot of patriotism and pride in their country, and there's a strong militarism. These dictators often dressed in military garb. They built up their militaries, and they went to war to prove the military might of these countries. So the first fascist government actually was in Italy, and that's where we get the word fascist from. Mussolini forms the League of Combat, or the Fascio di Capimento. Um, and from there, of course, we get fascist. So Italy was facing a lot of problems, economic problems. They see the rise of communism. A lot of people were very concerned that the communists would control Italy, and therefore they looked actually to the right, to the fascists, to kind of control them. And Mussolini taps into this. He is at first a teacher and then a socialist, and he was editing the socialist newspaper. But he becomes more military minded, advocates entering World War One. And there's kind of a disappointment after World War One that Italy didn't do as well as they thought they would do with some of the compensation. And a lot of people were kind of were drawn to them. Nationalists, people in the middle class, people that were anti-communist, even the church in Italy kind of liked the fascists because they were willing to work with the church as opposed to communists who just kind of wanted to end religion. So he forms his own militia, the Black Shirts. There's about 200,000 armed people in his political party by 1921. It's pretty astonishing. These are a lot of World War I veterans, young students. They would attack socialists and so forth. They marched on Rome, and they wanted to kind of have a part of the military and political power in Italy. And so the march in Rome was successful. There was no civil war. The government capitulates and they make Mussolini the prime minister. Now, this is actually quite a problem because before the march in Rome, in election 1921, they only received 7% of the vote. But once Mussolini is made prime minister and has control of the state in 1924, the election returns a 65% fascist victory, which means they have a majority rule. Mussolini is pretty much the dictator. And therefore, you have a fascist state. He takes control of the mass media, the movies, newspapers, and starts issuing propaganda. He has control of the schools, and he has um, become a dictator, and nobody is really willing to resist him. In Germany, there's a very similar story. Instead of Mussolini, you have Hitler. He's actually not born in Germany, but in Austria. At first, he tries to become an artist. He moves to Vienna. Unfortunately, he wasn't a great artist. If only he was a little bit better at art, then we wouldn't have to deal with all this crazy politics. And in Vienna, he gets exposed to a lot of new ideas, and particularly anti-Semitism, social Darwinism, extreme German nationalism, and he also gets his ideas on how to be a mass politician with a great orator, public speaker, and so forth. He fights in World War I very heroically, wins a lot of medals, finds a lot of purpose in war. Afterwards, he kind of joins, he isn't the founder, but he joins very early on the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazis, and he eventually becomes control of it. It's not just a political party, it was a mass movement. It had uniforms, had flags, badges, had its own militia, a newspaper. And by 1923, they had about 50,000 members and about 15,000 in the SA, the stormtroopers, these armed militia members. He tries to take over the government in the beer hall Putsch, the coup that fails in 1923. He's put in prison for a very short time. This is when he writes his Mein Kampf, but eventually gets out and he grows the party. It appealed to young people, appealed to nationalists, appealed to people that were sick of the communists and their growing power. And so he kind of uses those groups as the base and then grows from there. He was, of course, extreme anti-Semite. He was a pan-German nationalist. He was a militaristic individual, and all of those things form the basis of his views. Germany was facing a lot of economic problems. There was a lot of debt, hyperinflation. There was the reparation payments, and therefore people were looking for some of the parties that were not part of the government. And in each election, as the economy got worse and worse, the Nazis grew in power, and they, particularly after the Great Depression and the stock market crash in 1929, his growth kind of grows exponentially, and it's and the immediate aftermath with the high in unemployment that he receives about a third of the vote. Then in 1933, he is made chancellor. And he kind of wins a concession with the conservatives. They'll put Hitler in power. They'll kind of control him, use him as a puppet. And if he does poorly, they can get rid of him. But they were quite foolish. He passes the Enabling Act, which is to suspend the Constitution and all the rights of the people, and which limit the power of the government. And basically, he has complete control. Then there's this policy of Gleichschaltung, which is this kind of union where the Nazi party is a state within a state. So the Nazis take over education, they take over the media, they take over the police, they take over every facet of the state is kind of meshed with the Nazi party, except the military. The military is the one institution that it can't completely take over. Hitler at this point is a dictator, and again you have a Nazi state where they control the economics, they control the political structure, they control the educational structure, and he has now seized control of the state. In Russia, we have a different form of government. You have extreme communism. And the person who really puts this into place is Stalin. Lenin was the founder of the Soviet Union, but he dies in 1924. There's a struggle between Stalin and Trotsky, the two aides of Lenin, and Stalin kind of wins out and becomes kind of the rule of the party by the mid 1920s. And he gains political control. He basically eliminates all his rivals using fear and mass killings to purge anybody that opposes him. And he takes complete control of the economy. He has a central economy, uses 5-year plans, kind of forced industrialization. He also initiates collectivization, which is this is kind of the merging of all private property into large farms. And so you have a state command economy where everything is dictated from above and a very, very limited private property or free enterprise. As Stalin killed more people than anybody else probably in history. He had workers that were kind of put into government controlled facilities. And you have collectivization, which is the merging of all the farms into these huge co-ops. He has a forced famine in the Ukraine. This is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. They're growing food. He is taking their food and giving it, redistributing it to the urban areas. Meanwhile, millions of Ukrainian individuals died. If you dared question Stalin, you would end up in a gulag, these concentration camps in Siberia, where you do forced labor. And then periodically, for really no reason but just to control power, he would purge individuals. So he'd purge, people in the military, he'd purge, college professors, he'd purge people in the Communist Party. And that's, he had these huge show trials and say that they are against the revolution, against socialist principles, that and they need to be these killed in these massed trials and executions. So what do we see here is that we had a depression, economic kind of turmoil. The democratic countries, they were few and far between. They kind of had a larger government, but they left basic human rights intact. But you see the rise of a new form of government, fascism, as a response to the turmoil after World War I, and particularly in Italy and in Germany, but also in Spain to a lesser degree. And then we see also in response to the fascists, not so much, but as a creation of a more kind of a radical government in the Soviet Union under Stalin. So you have extreme communism. So we have the fascists, the communists, and these few democracies that are kind of hanging on. And then we'll look at the response of the fascists as they become more and more militaristic and they want more land and eventually pushing for the Second World War and the establishment of a larger German state in our next lecture.